Well, it seems to me that history is relevant because it keeps happening over and over again.
Yeah.
And of what use is an apology without an assurance that it will not continue to happen in the future?
You know, what worked, what, you know, how broad, and it is different. Japanese American incarceration very targeted, whereas Chinese exclusion really did set the stage for other laws. So it is a really important question, you know, and if you just relate it to this was done, it was horrible, is that enough of a lesson? Because so much of, you know, one of the first things I do when I teach, first day of class when I'm teaching U.S. history, is I talk about the ways in which Americans are often ahistorical. It's not that they don't love history or are not well informed about their history, but they separate. I'm a history buff. I love the battles, and I love all these, but it has no relevance to today. That's the most common understanding of history. And Americans especially, we love our myths, but we don't see the relevance. And I think especially in the debate over immigration, you see it especially with European immigrants European immigrant descendants who valorize the Ellis Island story, but then turn around and say, but we are so different from the immigrants coming today, whether it's from Asia or Latin America. That's a wonderful example of being ahistorical. And so is it enough to just to keep it historical without saying without raising the questions? Maybe you don't have to say, and it's very similar today, but you can raise the question, what has changed today? You know, it's a fine line, finally.
It's not enough to say I'm sorry. It's so easy to say that. Just sign a resolution, say we apologize for the Chinese Exclusion Act and what it did to all the immigrants who came through. I like the idea that, and this is something that the Japanese Americans did to make sure, is that they wrapped in, it's not so much the reparation money that was given, because they lost a lot of assets, property, but money, years in their life, you know, in being incarcerated. And so it's a token amount to pay back for that. But more than that, they had an educational fund set aside so that we could really understand and not just spread the history, but the lessons of this history. And so I think that something like that would make it more meaningful. And beyond that, you know, if they could just take another step. We apologize, we set up this educational fund to make sure that people know what happened and why and how this should be prevented. And then we will use this, you know, to begin setting comprehensive immigration reform or immigration policies that really show that they understand the negative repercussions of these kinds of unfair policies.
I do believe, even if you have an apology, if it's a national discussion, it raises the awareness of the story. So in spite of what happens, if you can have the discussion at a national political level, I think there's value there.
Oh yes, that's just a start.
When you mention about immigration reform, knowing how challenged that's going to be, I have a tendency trying to stay away from that, thinking other more novel reason. For example, when you're on the surface of the earth, when you single out one particular group, say you are not welcome, to me that's a very fundamental human dignity. So that is not really an immigration issue. Another way I can look at it is that when you deprive the right for them to become citizens, that are civil rights, that is not necessarily an immigration issues. So I'm just trying to think out loud what we can base on for the Congress to recognize, yes, there's an injustice done to this group of people. And I want them to define what that injustice is.
But don't forget that all other Asian immigrants were also denied the right to naturalized citizenship. And then, of course, at the same time, even those who had formal franchise, like African Americans. I mean, you know, so this is. I understand and I appreciate the tension, because you have the potential to say that this is broader than just the Chinese, but then you know it gets messy. But it's an opening point as well.
We're heading toward the conclusion that actually if we get it too directly connected to the immigration debate, then other political factors come into play. And the fundamental principles that we're looking at in many ways is this deprivation of civil rights and the taking away of, and one of the key things is the taking away of citizenship by a Congress that's motivated by very political rationales or motives and stuff and things of this sort. And what we want to do is call attention to that, because the parallels are there for anybody who is reasonable to make to what is happening today. And the trick or the balance for us is going to be, how do we do that in a political atmosphere that as soon as you say immigration reform, you're going to polarize everybody from any kind of debate on what is actually truly a universal question which Michael is getting about. How do you protect the rights of the weakest member of our community? And how did Congress not fulfill its responsibility to do that in the example of the Chinese? And then later in the example of the Hindus, quote unquote, the Filipinos, the Japanese, and now Hispanic Americans. Those parallels are there. It's so apparent that it's almost like you don't need to call attention to an immigration debate today. But if you focus on that Chinese as an example, to me the apology is not so much to the Chinese, it's an apology for Congress to the Americans that they didn't do what they were supposed to do for all Americans. They basically undermined or they use a very manipulated form of democracy. Because you have to remember, those laws were passed in a democratic process. Every one of those laws were passed by elected officials in very long debate. It was done in over 4 decades, 5 decades, and the discussion is there. It's not something that was totally irrationally done at the moment, but somehow Congress and our elected officials and all our other executive issues are carried away. And you could see that happening right now in the immigration debate on Arizona, and people are one-upping who can be the most enforcement-minded.